welcome everybody. Let's go ahead and let's make a space shooter. So first of all, you want to click the new button and you should come up with some project that's very similar to this. And you always want to make sure that you set a good location in for your Unity projects. You want to make it so easy that you can just simply upload it to the cloud or have a kind of job that will automatically upload all of your projects to the cloud. All right, so we're going to call this a simple, or we can call this awesome space shooter, and I always give a production number for this as well. So we're going to make a space shooter. You want to make sure that it's 2D because we're making a 2D, and we're going to go ahead and push create. Now it's going to take a couple seconds for it to load, and the reason is that when you create a Unity project, you actually add in quite a bit of extra libraries and just to make it work. If you've ever tried to code a game literally from scratch, you'll know that you have to actually write a lot of code. Now, the best part about Unity is that code is pre-written for you. And what that means for you is that you don't have to go and actually write a lot of the code that would be tedious or boring. That's why we use this model here. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to just zoom out here, and this is probably going to be what we're looking for. Before we even get started, let's click the camera, and I'm just using my magnifier on the fly here. You can see that this is camera in the middle, and you can kind of see that there's a preview here. But what we're looking for is we're looking for this size, okay? And you can kind of see it in here. And if you look at this, okay, we got the size here. Let's change that to 20. Okay, so we're just going to make this bigger. And what that's going to do is that's just going to make everything just a little bit bigger here. Okay, let's go ahead and let's add in some of our players here. So let's go to create and right click on the assets, create, and then we're going to go to sprites and let's make the main player a triangle. That looks pretty good, and we'll simply call this player. Okay, we'll move this and drag it out into the middle of the screen here. And that's a little small, so maybe we'll make this 10 by 10 by 10. And that looks pretty good. And by the way, if you push W, you can kind of move it around. And that's pretty good, although it's maybe a little bit too big. So maybe 5 by 5 by 5. And of course, I am adding it into the scale here, 5, 5, 5. Okay, that's probably a pretty good size for it here. And remember, we can always change the color if we want to, but for now, let's just leave it white, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to go and add in, for instance, we're going to add in a couple of other items here. So we're going to add in a create, and we're going to add in the sprite, and we'll add in a square, okay? And we'll call this the enemy. All right, and we'll drag this out too. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply drag it out here. Maybe make this 4 by 4 by 4. That's probably pretty good. And let's make the enemy kind of a reddish color. Doesn't matter what the red color is right now. Let's just make the enemy red, and that looks pretty good. Now, what we're also going to do is let's go back to the main camera, and let's maybe change this back to, we can maybe change this back to 15, just so that it's a little bit, maybe a little bit smaller, but we can play around with that as much as we want for now. But let's just take a look at this, and yeah, that's probably looking pretty good. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to create another sprite, and we can make this a circle, okay? And we're going to call this projectile, okay? And as you can see, all of these items here, we got the projectile, we got the player, and we got the enemy here. Now, I'm going to drag out the projectile, and 1, 1, 1 is probably good for now. 1, 1, 1 is good for now, and we can probably make it white just because, well, our player is white as well. So that looks pretty good. Now, essentially, these are going to be the two main objects that we're working with here. What we're going to have to do is we're going to have to create a prefab. Okay, so you want to make sure that we go and create the prefab. And what we'll call this is we'll call this prefab enemy. And we're going to drag the enemy onto the prefab. just like that here. And it should look something like this. And the reason why we're adding in that prefab is so that we can spawn multiple enemies. Now we're going to need to do the exact same process here with the sprite, with the projectile here. So we need to go to prefab, and we'll call this prefab projectile. All right, and then we'll simply drag this over to the prefab. All right, so now we have all of these items here. We have the enemy, we have the player, and we have the projectile here. And we'll be adding in items as we go along. Let's go ahead and let's add in some scripts here. So as you can see, we have our player, and we need to go and we need to make this player move around. So first things first is we can add in scripts in multiple ways. And the ways that I like to add in scripts is I've always done it where I went to right click, create, and then we can have in a C# script here. Okay, and that's not a bad idea. In fact, it's actually a pretty good idea to do it this way. However, if you want to add in a script that's specifically for a object, just go to the add component here. We'll just add component, and we can type in script, and you can see that there's a new script. And if I move down here, you can see that we have our script here. Now what we're going to do is we need to call the script something. You want to make sure that you call your scripts in a certain way, and that certain way is going to be, for instance, something that makes sense. So I'm going to call this player logic. Okay, create an add, and you can see that it does indeed add player logic. Now what's also interesting is that if we zoom in here, this player logic script is now attached to the player. So we haven't really done anything yet, but the point is it is attached. So all the code that we've had in there does work. Now, if you ever want to disable it, like you're debugging or something, you can always click that little button right there. Let's go into player logic here, and let's double click that. And what should happen is the MonoDevelop should pop up here. So that is what comes with Unity. If you're on a PC, what happens is that you might be using Visual Studio. The reason why I'm using MonoDevelop is because, well, we're on a Mac, and the Mac and PC versions are very similar. So whether you're on a Mac or a PC, this is going to be your best way here. Now, one thing I like to do just for purposes of filming is to make it as big as I can. And all I did is I pushed the Alt button and I used my wheel. I use a mouse personally just because I get a lot of repetitive stress. So I actually use a mouse which I operate with my thumb, and that way I can spend hours and hours on the computer without any kind of issue here. So first things first is let's set up our player movement. Okay, so we're going to set up a void here, and we're going to call this player movement. Okay, and this is that's exactly what it's going to be doing. You want to name your voids, your variables. You want to name everything and have it make sense. So what we're going to do is we're going to say in the update we're going to call player movement. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, and now we can go and we can add in our movement here. Now this particular space game, this space shooter, is going to be really simple. It's not going to be very complicated, and furthermore, what it's going to be is that this is going to have essentially two axes. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to say if, and we're going to say input dot get key. Okay, and the key code is going to be .a. All right, we'll just simply move that in here, and you always want to make sure that you close off your brackets to make sure that it works here. Now what we're going to do is we're going to move it over. Okay, so we're going to go to transform dot translate, and what transform dot translate is going to do is it's going to simply move it over. Now the one that we want is, I'm just pushing the arrow key to go down. We want the float X, the float Y, and the float Z. So we're going to move it across here. Okay, so we're going to move this player -1, 0, 0. Now, if we really want to, we can go to the top here and add in a public float called player speed and make that equal to 1.0f. And what that's going to do is we're going to be able to change that if we want here. So we're going to make this negative player speed. Okay, and that should move it across. Now what I'm going to do in addition to this is I'm going to literally copy this and paste it in here. And we have our input.get key, and in this case we're going to make it the D. Okay, so I'm going to be using the A and the D key to move around. Now if you want to, you can make it the left arrow and the right arrow. So for example, if I type in left arrow, you can use the left arrow and right arrow. The reason why I like using the D key is it's WASD control or WASD control, and I'm just used to that personally. Right? You can actually add in both of them if you wish. So we're going to add that in here, and we're just going to say that this is player speed. Okay, so there we go. Now save it. You do have to save it, and let's hop back into Unity here. All right, it might take a couple seconds for it to load here, but if we run it, and we haven't run our game yet here, and look at that. Oh, look, that's pretty good. I think that's actually quite awesome. Now it does nothing, but there's a bit of a problem. I can move this way off the screen, and we do not want that. We definitely do not want that. So let's click our player, and you can see here that we have our position. Okay, so our position here is going to be, we're going to say, look at this, we're going to make it so far, and it's going to be about 30. So what am I looking at here? Well, I'm looking how far we can go to the left and right, and the number that I'm looking at is this X position right there. And you can see here that this X position is, well, almost 30. Now, you could make it 29.21 if you wanted to, but for the most part, I just like to make it a round number. Why? Because it's easier to work with. So what we have to do is go back into MonoDevelop, and we have to go and say, well, we have to make this in between two values here. So we're going to add the and here, and we're going to say transform.position.x is greater than or equal to -30. Okay, and what that's going to do is that's going to allow it to only go up to -30. That's actually pretty neat. And then if you want to, we could copy and paste it, or I'm just going to say transform.position.x is less than or equal to 30. Okay. Now, if you really wanted to, you could add in a float here. We could call this max player x distance and make that equal to 30. Okay, and we'll say max player x distance, and then that way, instead of, like, let's say you have to use this variable like 50 times in your project. Well, instead of using it 50 times, you could just, and if you have to change it, you have to change it 50 times. But with this, you only have to change it once. So that's pretty cool. So let's take a look at this, and let's see where we are at. So let's go and let's add in the play button here. It takes a couple seconds, and move it, and look at that. It stops. So I think that's pretty good. Now, that actually looks not so bad. We got this going pretty well. And, you can see that the X value and the Y value look pretty good. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in a little bit of an offset here, and I'm just going to, instead of make it 30, I'm just going to make it 29. Okay, that's going to put it, for the most part, on the side here. One thing you do want to avoid is you do want to avoid being exactly on the edge. Generally, this is not a good spot for you to interact. Lots of times the edge of the screen sometimes has unpredictable behavior. So you generally want to have a margin. So you can see how there's a gap in between the player and the side here. That is a good thing. You definitely want that. Okay, so let's take a look at what else we need to do to make this game. We've added in some scripts to the player here. What we're going to do is we're going to continue with this player logic, and we're going to add in, well, the projectile shooting. So in order to do that, we need to add in a public game object. So let's add that in. We're going to add a public game object, and we're going to call this projectile. And if you want to, you can put game object at the end of that. But essentially, that's what we need to do. All right. Now, in order to shoot this projectile, what we need to do is we need to add in two more variables. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to format this. We're going to add in a couple more items here. We're going to add in another public float. We're going to call this shooting speed and make that equal to 0.5f. Again, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add in a Boolean variable, and we're going to call this, and if we really wanted to, we can make it a public Boolean, or just the public bool, that is, and we're going to say is shooting is equal to true. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow us to either stop or start the shooting. Now, why is this important? Well, let's say you end the game, you want to stop shooting. So what this is going to be a very simple game where you're always shooting no matter what. Now, it is possible to make this where you add in a button to kind of push here, but we're just going to make this constantly shoot no matter what. And in order to do that, we need to take a look at, how to make a timer here. Okay, so let's go back and let's add in, for instance, well, it's not a void, it's called an IEnumerator. Okay, and so we're going to call this IEnumerator. All right, and we're going to call this projectile shoot timer, and that's exactly what it's going to do. Okay, it should turn blue, by the way, and save it. I always save as much as I can. Now, we're going to add in a while loop. So we're going to say while, and we need to add in brackets here. We're going to say is shooting is double equal to true. Okay, and the reason why we did this is shooting is because when that Boolean variable is active, when it's actually an is shooting variable, what that does is that we will go and we will spawn the projectile here. So first of all, before we even do that, when you have an IEnumerator, you do have to return. Okay, so we're going to say yield return. All right, and remember it's yield return, and then we're going to say new wait 4 seconds, and then this is going to be shooting speed. So again, if we want to change the shooting speed, we can. We don't have to manually go in and change that here. But what we do need to do is actually spawn these projectiles here. So let's go and let's add in a void. We'll say spawn projectile, and we'll close that off here. And in here we'll instantiate. Now that's just a fancy word for create object. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at this one here. So it's the third one down. We need an object to spawn, we need a vector3 position, and then we need a rotation. Now remember that when you spawn an object in Unity 2D, it kind of is more like you're spawning it in 3D, but you're forgetting an axis. So that's why this is more complicated than it has to be. So let's go ahead and what are we going to spawn here? We're going to spawn the projectile. That's good. Then we're going to say the position. It's going to be transform.position. You can see it's a vector3, works out. And then lastly, we're going to do quaternion dot, and then we're just going to do identity. Now, this last item here is technically, when you go to older coding languages, you do have to write in code that is not as useful as it may seem. So you just have to write quaternion.identity in there. And if you've ever coded in older coding languages, you know that you do have to write a lot of extraneous code. Newer coding languages, you would just have to write the first two, but the last one, you don't really have to write. Okay, so right now it's all working, but we have to actually start this. And so how do we start this IEnumerator? Well, we're going to go to start coroutine, and then we're going to go to projectile shoot timer. Make sure you add in the appropriate amount of brackets here. And this has to be in the start void. Okay, so we'll start coroutine, and what that will do is that will actually go and start this IE numerator. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and save it. If you haven't already done so, let's hop back into Unity for a second here and make sure that the game isn't running. And we'll just take a look here. And sometimes it takes a few seconds for it to work. Okay, now if you look at the player logic, well, all these public variables have shown up. Most particularly, though, this projectile has worked here. So this projectile, what we're going to do is we're going to say that this projectile here, we need to add in the prefab. So I'm going to drag that over here, and we're going to drag in that prefab projectile. And what that's going to do is that we now have an object to reference to spawn. So let's take a look at this. So if we run it, well, it's kind of working, I guess. But the problem is that we need to go and we need to add in, well, this projectile here to kind of move up, right? So how do we do that? Well, we need to go to our prefab projectile here. We'll go to add component, and we'll add in a new script, and we'll call this projectile logic. Okay, and what we'll do here is this will now be added to our projectile logic here, and what I'll do is I'll open that up, and you can see that we now have our projectile logic here. Looks good. Everything looks great here. So what we need to do now is essentially, it's very simple. We're going to add in a void here. We'll call this move projectile to top. And if you really want to add in or make your code a little bit more transversable to other projects, you can say move transform to top, and that way you don't if you need to do this in a different game, you don't have to rewrite the code. So what are we going to do? Whenever you write in transform, if I haven't already told you, transform is referencing the object that the script is attached to. So remember how we just added this to the projectile? When you write transform, it's referencing that that projectile here. Okay, so we're going to go to transform.translate transform.translate, and we're going to move this up to the top here. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll say public float, and we'll call this transform speed, make that equal to, well, let's make it 0.5f. Now again, we can change that as much as we want here. So we're going to move this along the y-axis, and we're going to say that this is projectile, or in this case, it's transform speed. Okay, so that, again, you don't have to actually go and rewrite this. All right, make sure you save it, and look at that. That actually looks pretty good. So if we go back into Unity, we can take a look at this here. All right, and so if we run it, you know, everything is kind of working out, except these items are not being spawned here. Now, there could be several reasons for that. The first reason is that you may have not saved it, okay? And that's one thing. However, what really should be happening is you need to actually call the spawn projectile here. And that's really why it's not doing that. But you do need to save it. Let's hop back into Unity here, and let's take a look at that. So we now have, well, a bunch of items here, and you know, you can see that, well, they're spawning now, and they are spawning at the right location, but they're not moving up to the top. So let's take a look at that here. So let's move to this item here, and you can see that the projectile logic here is moving to the transform speed. So if we look at this here, we have all of this working, except for you have to call move transform to top in the update section. So these are common mistakes that a lot of people make, and when I'm prototyping, I often make this mistake too. So you always want to make sure that you call everything. So just want to make sure that you do that. So let's hop back into Unity, make sure you save everything, and we'll take a look here. So there we go. And look at that. That's looking pretty good. Now remember, you can always change these items here, right? See this transform speed? We can always change that to, let's say, 1.0. Now the difference here, though, is that we can make it, 10 if we wanted to, right? And that's too fast. Or we could really make it really, really slow, like that here. And you can see that they're slowly moving out. Now, as soon as I click stop, remember that this projectile speed does not go back. So let's go and let's make it 0.8. That's probably pretty good here. And by the way, we should probably save it. So let's save this as game scene. All right, we'll save it to assets, and there you go. So we're just going to save everything there, and let's run it one more time before we move on. And you can see that here. Yeah, look at that. That's actually probably pretty good. Notice how these are, what they're doing is we're actually creating different cloned objects there, okay? So we now have a bunch of scripts here, and we need to go and continue on with the project.